Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the EDC Coffee Chat. We are excited this morning to have our newly elected Director of Community Development for Clallam County talking to us this morning about lots of different topics related to community development in the unincorporated and possibly incorporated areas of our county. Just a few housekeeping details before we begin. I ask that you put your computer or your phone or whatever you've dialed in on mute so we don't inadvertently pick up any background noise. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. We like this to be fairly interactive, and we'll call on you, or if you'd prefer, you can just put your question in the chat and Bruce can answer that. But we've got a lot of really smart experts on the call here regarding housing and our lack of housing, and also just overall zoning issues and the process that the state has created to zone things. So with that, I am honored to introduce Bruce Emery, our county's Director of Community Development. Take it away, Bruce.
Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate that, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak with folks. Been at it for a couple of months now, and you know, we certainly know some things, and there's still some things that we need to learn. One of the first questions that we came up with deals with the state of the housing crisis, which I think all would agree is one of the leading issues that we face in Clallam County, statewide, and perhaps even nationwide. The fact is, we don't know precisely what the shortfall is for Clallam County. You know, I think we all know intuitively that that we fall short of housing. Everybody, we certainly see the homeless. There's a lot of things contributing that as well. But just from a mere standpoint of do we have adequate stock to meet the housing needs, I think we all tend to agree that the answer at this point is no. We just don't know for certain to what degree. We did take a look at current census information available for Clallam County. From the 2021 census, there were a total of 33,291 households and a rate of about 2.25 persons per household. So if you just take that number and calculate it out, there's roughly 74,905 folks that are currently residing in households. But the overall census information shows that there's 77,625 people as of 2022, which actually is a drop of about 125 persons from 2021 residing in Clallam County. So that gives us an excess of 2,720 people that theoretically, according to these numbers, are currently unhoused or are having to seek alternative housing solutions that didn't make it into the census. When you divide that by the 2.25 persons per household, that gives us a rough estimate of around 1,200 unit shortfall for broader Clallam County. And that, of course, includes the cities of Forks, Port Angeles, and Sequim as well. So generally speaking, the population has increased by about 5,950 in the last 10 years. So it's about an 8.3% climb in a 10-year period, or about 595 per year on average. As I noted, interestingly enough, between 2021 and 2022, we actually dropped. So there's a fluctuation going on. There's other factors, I think, contributing to that specific change between last year and this year. But at least you get a picture that overall we are continuing to grow, and as a result, there's a continuing need for growth in our housing stock. During that same period, the last 10 years, we've had a roughly 1,911 units built, new units built in unincorporated Clallam County.
How many was that, Bruce?
I'm
What,
sorry,
say that again. Say that again. How many was it?
1,911.
1,911. Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
and that's based on our permit data
Okay.
for new construction. So it averages about 191 per year. And we're down in 2022 to about 185, which I thought was interesting because I would have expected that number to be a little bit less, but you know, it's still within the realm of the permit pace that we've been seeing. But what this tells us overall is just to keep pace with new housing needs between unincorporated Clallam County and the three cities, we have to generate about 265 new units per year in order to keep pace with this overall rate of growth that we're experiencing. So therein lies the challenge. Now, there are several reasons. I'm going to go ahead and try share screen. So let me know if this flops or not. And we're going to go with.
That box is only a single. You know what I mean?
Oh.
Let's see.
We got someone that's not on mute. Let me try to, there we go. Okay. There we go. Does everybody see that okay? I do.
You can see my screen?
Yes. Yep.
Oh, very good.
Sure can.
All right. So that's just the introduction. So I wanted to just go over some of the basic reasons why we're seeing increases in home prices. This is also contributing in part to to our inability to keep pace currently with the rate of growth in Clallam County. And as we all know, since the pandemic, there's been issues with supply chain. Having come from the private sector, I'm pretty well aware of that. During that time, we saw, for example, OSB, you know, the 5/8 OSB that you use in your roofing, for example, go from $11 a sheet up to $111 a sheet, and then have it come back down and moderate around $14 per sheet. So those kind of variations have been challenging construction companies and so forth, and even people planning on building, just trying to nail down what their budget's going to be for a construction project. Changes in the energy code. Now, this is a state mandate that comes from the building. What is it?
Washington State Building Council.
I should have wrote that down. I always miss that. The Building Code Council, exactly. And what it is they give you an array of choices to choose from in order to earn energy code credits. This year, you're required to demonstrate at least 6 credits in order to have a building permit approved. And there's a whole range of things that are available for people to select from in order to achieve that mandatory 6 credit threshold. But several of them include significantly costly items. For example, tier 3 heat pumps for a water heater. A regular water heater would run you about $600 to $800. Tier 3 heat pump runs a little over $2,000. High efficiency heat pump, for example, is going to run you $20,000 to $25,000 depending on the size of the building. There's also credits that can be earned for lower window U value, which again is the rating of its ability to retain heat. But in most cases, people are having to go to triple pane, which are significantly costly, more costly than your double pane windows. And one of the things that is becoming more and more obvious that has to be a part of construction is the ability to install solar panels. But to receive credits for them, you have to be able to generate 1,200 watts return energy, which takes at least 8 panels. So, you know, we're looking at a minimum of $10,000 added for that feature alone. And in Clallam County, of course, we have the clouds and the low sun angle during the winter months, which makes it very difficult to achieve any kind of return on investment for things of that nature. So all in all, and lastly, and one of the big items that we're looking at is there's now the requirement for exterior foam insulation, which is basically a 2-inch rigid foam that exists between your framing and your siding. And this not only is costly, it also takes a lot more in terms of how you construct the siding. The fasteners have to be longer, and you have to figure out how you map your framing structure, so you know that your screws are actually digging into the framing properly in order to give it rigidity and longevity. So these things are all creating an atmosphere where substantial costs are being added. And one of the things that I think is really undersung in all this is just how much of our labor force was lost in the downturn between 2008 and 2012. During that period, we lost about 70% of the workforce, making it very difficult to, even if you had a project and you had funding to do it, to find an outfit that was adequately staffed to be able to handle it. Certainly folks who are in it as a business doing spec home development or custom home development still has to outsource certain things, framing, plumbing, electrical, etc. And it's very difficult to keep those guys lined up. It adds a lot of time and additional costs to the project. Lack of public infrastructure in urban areas is another key item. There are places within the city of Port Angeles, places within the unincorporated urban growth areas that currently are not served by municipal water and sewer service. And that is creating issues for adequately densifying the urban areas. And we're missing out on housing opportunities as a result. And lastly, and this one I like to harp on a lot because it's so critical, we've gone from 5 major engineering firms as of 15, 20 years ago down to 1. And during that time, we've also seen an increase in the amount of requirements where engineering is required in new construction. Also, the engineering firm that exists also gets a lot more business from local jurisdictions who are actually outsourcing engineering projects to them. So it's creating a substantial choke point, substantial delay for doing things like new subdivisions or home construction where it's a little bit beyond simply prescriptive requirement. And that can add months, if not years, to a project. And again, that challenges the development in terms of how to structure it and how to plan for the costs, because costs today may be substantially different than they are 6 months from now. Any questions on that so far?
I don't see anything in the chat. It's a lot of really interesting information. I know we've been trying to recruit some civil engineers to come out here. Well, actually structural engineers to come out here from firms, starting up their own firms locally. But we haven't had much success yet. I think there are some around that are in, one-offs, but not certainly a major firm. And we just need to get more people aware that that those other folks that, are one-person firm maybe are another option. I see actually that Ray has a question or has her hand up. Ray, do you want to?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we use engineering firms, home builders or individual builders use engineering firms that are in different counties, cities, or states? Or is there some reason, like some unique knowledge or about local codes that local firms have that non-local firms don't have, that require us to use the one firm supplying the issue here that is in town?
The answer is yes and yes. Yes, in fact, I was part of a project that we were beginning to initiate. and we were looking out of town, looking over in Bremerton, for example, and they could provide it. It turns out that the rates were higher, and also there was kind of a learning curve that needed to be accomplished in terms of getting familiarized with local geologic conditions and so forth. Generally speaking, construction is the same throughout the state. It follows the same code. So a lot of the stuff is very similar, but there are local nuances that are a little different. I wouldn't say that's a big barrier, but I would say that all things considered, most places are experiencing a very similar circumstance of shortage of engineers. There's been increased requirements for it, and there just hasn't been a lot of recruitment into the industry. And so you're competing with other folks, and inevitably that's going to raise the price.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we shift gears slightly. I wanted to talk briefly about the Housing Solutions Committee that's been trying to grapple with some of these issues and come up with some ideas about how we might approach the housing shortage, housing costs, the housing crisis in general in Clallam County. There's been basically two primary focuses coming out of this group, and it's kind of created two separate areas of expertise. One is focusing sort of on the government-funded solutions for the homeless and the low-income sector, and the other is looking at sort of the broader housing stock and how we might be able to solve some of these problems to generate more housing, just for the middle income and the range of housing availability out there. I tend to favor the latter personally, simply because by increasing the housing stock, you're increasing supply, and as a supply, as a demand supply driven market, the more houses you have, it stands that the more affordable they become. So if you create a lot of housing, for example, in the middle income sector, there's going to be fewer people competing for lower cost housing, and opening up additional opportunities there, and again having the effect of moderating the price. So I wanted to go over some of the issues that are some of the things that we've been working on in that sort of that second tier of focusing on increasing housing stock in general, and performing a multifaceted countywide housing analysis to identify barriers or choke points in housing. And this speaks to some of the things I already mentioned, like a supply chain, getting that back up and stabilized, increasing availability of engineering services. Some of the specific measures that we're looking at under this heading is doing a SWOT analysis of housing production in general and making sure we're kind of covering all bases. Looking for recommendations to local jurisdictions on how to reduce requirement and streamline permitting processing, which I'm happy to report that in Clallam County, we're doing pretty good in that. But we all can improve in that area, and that's something that I think would be helpful. Again, when you consider the time factor in managing a project, it's better to have your permit quick so you have predictability in terms of your material costs and so forth. Doing feasibility studies on various size housing projects across jurisdictions. And again, looking for where the choke points are, so that, when we're looking at, we might figure things out for single family residences, but we also know that we're lacking in multifamily housing, and how we would go about increasing the opportunities for multifamily housing might be an offshoot of that effort. And doing cost analysis of housing production to determine and compare costs state mandated regulations and other market forces versus local regulations to see what level of impact local regulations have on costs. You know, in that we might be looking at the impacts of impact fees, for example, versus doing you know, LIDs for public improvement projects. Certainly considering the impacts, which I've already mentioned, of like the energy code, which, by the way, you know, kudos to the state for wanting to make housing efficient. It's just we also have to have our eyes open that there's a related cost in that is putting a kind of a wet towel on the industry. Develop and highlight options and or funding to reduce or subsidize housing related infrastructure costs. And this again goes back to what I had mentioned, that there are places where there's lacking infrastructure. I think of west of Port Angeles, where we have designated industrial lands that are currently, they're served by a limited supply of potable water through Dry Creek water system, and they don't even have sewage disposal. I think that we would go a long way by getting urban services into that area to help facilitate economic development, which is the flip side of this whole question. It isn't just a matter of houses cost a lot, is that we're also failing to provide the family wage jobs so that the median income family can actually afford the houses that are out there. Establish a county level land bank to identify existing underused public land that has development potential and acquire other strategic properties for development. This is just a way of pulling together the land that's available, that's sitting there unused, and seeing if we can do things to provide incentives for development to come in and use that property to develop targeted housing that is available for middle or low income families, and what we can do to sort of usher that along. And in pursuit of the above goals, the Housing Solutions Committee should engage the for-profit building community in developing housing solutions. And of course, under the heading of no-brainer, talk to the folks who do it for a living. What are they encountering? What are the current barriers? I'd like to think I've mentioned a few, but there are certainly additional nuances that impact their ability to meet the housing needs for the county. And I think by leveraging the private sector really is the only way forward with any appreciable and lasting effect. There's no way we're gonna subsidize our way out of this problem. It really does have to come from creating the economic circumstances in which the industry can solve the problem on our behalf.
Really well said, Bruce. So Ray has a question in the chat. I'll go ahead and ask it for her. How many more housing units can the current sewage treatment plant support? That would be the city of Port Angeles. And then of course the city of Sequim has one as well. And I think there's quite a bit of capacity there. I know Matt Hewish is on, maybe he could comment, but do you know?
I don't know that offhand. That's one of those need to knows as we're getting into the comprehensive plan and looking at public utilities for urban areas. That'll be part of the joint discussion with the cities on that effort.
I haven't heard that that's a limitation at all.
Yeah, I haven't either. I know that we're dependent on the city of Sequim for the UGA in Carlsberg, which, you know, a lot of discussion has been going around lately about water system expansion, which I believe it's 475 units that the PUD is now able to serve in addition to their current service area. And that's going to provide some development opportunity. My understanding is there shouldn't be any issue with the city handling the sewage disposal, because we've contracted with the city of Sequim to handle that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So any other questions or discussion on that?
Doesn't look like it. Lots of great information. Thank you.
You betcha.
And actually, will you share the slides with me so that we can post them on our website and people can download them from there along
Yeah,
with?
I'll email them after the meeting.
Perfect. Thank you. And so people can have the slides along with listening to the recording if they'd like, they want to share that.
Sure.
Thank you.
So shifting gears a little bit, Clallam County and its various cities are subject to the requirements of the Growth Management Act found under RCW 3670A. And under the act, there are mandatory comprehensive plan elements and optional comprehensive plan elements. Currently, there's 14 total. There's a land use element requirement, and that includes designating your urban growth areas. These are areas that include cities and also portions of unincorporated cities that are on the periphery that are appropriate for expanding urban level development and ultimately for annexation purposes. In there, you're also designating your rural areas, and these are areas that should be free of sprawl or zoning that creates sprawl, and your resource lands. And in Clallam County, those include agricultural lands of long-term commercial significance and commercial forest resource lands. And within there, there's also aggregate as one of the designations, but they typically overlap well with commercial forest. Not in all cases, but in most of them. There has to be a housing element. And this year, there's been a lot of activity in Olympia, increasing the requirements and the options that we have to plan over to try to address concerns of housing. Certainly in Olympia, they're very concerned about the housing stock and the state of housing that we just got through discussing. And in a general sense, a lot of the legislation is aimed at expanding the available array of housing types within our urban areas. In other words, kind of eliminating sort of the sacred cow of the single family residence and saying, you know, allow duplexes, allow townhouses, condominiums, and even multifamily, you know, apartment type developments. This also is an interesting element that in looking at the APA, the American Planning Association articles, they used to kind of recommend that you keep these various stages of residential use sort of segregated. And now the common wisdom is to integrate them so that you create acceptance and you don't create, and also maintain land values, even though you're switching over to higher density. So these are things that I think we will be dealing with in the comprehensive plan update. I know the city of Port Angeles is already heading in that direction, and I believe that the city of Sequim likewise will be heading there, and Forks and so on. Capital facilities plan, these are, you know, your plant size government or quasi-government facilities that we have to plan for, and it also includes a projection of needs and where these facilities might be best located. A utilities element that has you inventory, figure out where your utilities are, your capacities, and make sure that your land use element is consistent with that. You don't want to plan, you know, high density residential development in an area that is lacking sewer or water. So you need to be able to identify the provision of those services, even if they're not already there, but to have within your capital facilities plan, a 6-year funding mechanism to get them there. And as I mentioned, a rural element, and this is basically non-sprawl. It's required for counties. Under the Growth Management Act, issues and concerns and conflicts that come up typically go to the Growth Hearings Board. And we have 25 years of Growth Hearings Board decisions now where they kind of have established sort of where the bright lines in the sand are. One of them is if it's rural, it needs to be 5 acres per unit or less in density. If it's urban, it needs to be 4 units per acre or greater. Now, there's some justification for densities that kind of fill in the middle, like Lamrid's, local areas of more intense rural development, and critical areas can be considered in your urban areas when it comes to establishing density that's appropriate under those limitations. But those are the types of things we have to deal with. Transportation element that looks at projected needs and how you're going to go about funding it. Right-of-way acquisition, things of that nature. And for the cities, there's a port element required if you have a maritime port revenues exceeding 60 million. Optional comp plan elements, which we do have in our comprehensive plan, include economic development, which I think is valid. I think in our case, driving, for example, getting the services out to our industrial areas, and also taking a look, making sure that our commercial and industrial land base is adequate to meet future demand and job creation. Parks and recreation element, even though we have the Olympic National Park, there's a lot of folks that are wanting to see additional trails and localized outdoor recreational opportunities. So that's part of the lift that needs to be done under that heading. Conservation element, solar energy element, those dovetail not only with your utilities, but also require consideration, for example, of what we're doing with regard to climate change. And so bringing in the science and evaluating what future needs are and developing policies that are responsive to those needs in that context. Recreation element is a little bit dovetailed into parks and recreation, but again, you're looking at per capita need for recreational opportunities. Sub-area plans, these are things like Carlsberg has its own sub-area plan. Joyce Piedmont Urban Growth Area has its own plan. Clallam Bay CQ has its own plan, and the various UGAs, the urban growth areas around Sequim, Port Angeles, and Forks, all have their own individualized plans. We also have the county divided into 4 basic regions. There's the east end of the county, the Sequim region, central, which is roughly Port Angeles, then the Straits regional planning area, and the West End regional planning area, all 4 having sort of different economic needs, housing needs, et cetera, that then get dovetailed into sort of the regulatory scheme and how we can best serve those areas. So that's the GMA in a nutshell, which I don't know if it at this point means anything. Are there any questions on that?
Let's see, we've got something in the chat here from Laurel. Laurel, do you want to ask it?
Sure. Of course, now I just lost it. Hold on a second. What impacts do you anticipate as more and more people move here because of things like climate issues? It seems to me that it's reasonable to assume that the more wildfires there are in California, and they're even probably worse, that the effect of that on their housing stock, that more people would move here, particularly since we have a robust tourism industry that introduces people to the area. So how do we plan for this in the comp plan, and what do you foresee in that regard?
Well, I think that's a brilliant question, because we are going to be a destination for what they're calling climate refugees.
Yep.
As other places of the nation become less livable, people are going to want to move here. We're actually in an area that, by its location, by all predictive models, will be reasonably resilient, comparatively speaking. It doesn't mean it'll be easy, But what does that mean? Well, it means getting out in front of this wave. Expect it. Expect that we need to have a zoning program that doesn't shoot us in the foot, that allows for expansion of urban growth areas to accommodate future growth, that does not destroy our resource lands, or even the rural character, the part that makes this place a wonderful place to live. I think we've all kind of come to an agreement that that's a pretty nice feature. We wouldn't want to become Spanaway, for example. And so following the current course when it comes to land use planning. Another one that comes to mind, and I think it's going to be pretty interesting, is, okay, you know, we have abundant water resources in Clallam County. We've got the rivers. City of Port Angeles is reliant on flows in the Elwha River, for example. Well, what will climate change mean for that? And if the science indicates that there may be some question as to whether the suitability of those sources going into the future exists, then we have to come up with alternatives. What's plan B? Now's the time to do that. Now's the time to figure out what those sources are and setting ourselves up so that we can transition as needed to be able to fortify our water resources, for example. One of the other components is, and I'll get into this a little bit, time permitting, when we get to the legislative updates, but part of what is achieved under the Growth Management Act is encouragement of development to occur in urban areas where urban services exist. Those also happen to be, for the most part, are job locations. So as we focus development in urban areas, we're actually reducing the amount of trips being generated per day, or the length of those trips. And so there's an efficiency built into that that will reduce greenhouse emissions insofar as Clallam County's contribution is to it. But it also reduces the amount of energy needed. People who live in the I-5 corridor typically have a long commute. I complain when my commute goes beyond 10 minutes. So I got it pretty good. Yeah.
So there's a couple more questions. Micah, do you want to ask your question, or I can for you? Not seeing Micah come off mute. So his question is a good one. Does the GMA allow higher density near transit in the county, like Laird's Park and Ride?
Well,
it's currently not zoned for it.
No, and that alone isn't justification. It doesn't mean those aren't adequate, good places to have a park and ride, because I think they're regionally accessible. But the GMA basically requires us to designate urban growth areas. And those are areas within close proximity. And in sizing urban growth areas, they can only be based on projected growth over the next 20 years. And those are based on numbers provided by the Office of Financial Management. So it's very limited in what our flexibility is. Sure, we'd like to make our urban growth areas bigger and give us lots of different opportunities, but the GMA limits that specifically to your 20-year projected need, and then have it affiliated with existing urban centers where services are already available and can be provided, like sewer, water, power, so forth.
Gotcha. So Dale Jarvis asked a good question. A bunch of people are working to obtain state funding for a new SQUIM Schools Career Technical Education Center to assist with workforce development, and particularly in construction. Are there other ways the county and your department can help keep young people in the area to be part of that piece of the workforce that's so needed?
Well, I think the best answer and the best we can do comes down to our zoning. Do we have adequate industrial land to attract family wage jobs? Is there a reason to stay? Is there a future here for them? When they see a housing market that is escaping them economically and no real prospect for a job that, you know, unless you become an engineer, that might be one way of doing it. But the point being is we need to make sure that we have the zoning array that allows for both the increase in family wage jobs and the increase in housing stock to bring those numbers down. Then, hey, Clallam County is a great place to live if you can afford it. And that's what I think would go furthest in terms of attracting to young people the desire to stay here. Now, maybe they'll leave for a while. Maybe they'll go to Seattle, Tacoma. But I believe that once they realize what those places hold compared to what is held here, they'll probably want to come back.
Yeah, I think a lot would. Layla has a great comment here. As a college student, this economy and community make it challenging to stay here.
Yeah.
And we know that. And I'll tell you, that's one of our major focuses for the Clallam EDC. We are looking at the workforce and how can we make things more viable and a better quality of life for the workforce. We're not, you know, that's our mission statement. There are important things for the people that are in the lowest stratosphere, that entities like Colleen Robinson's Habitat for Humanity handle and Peninsula Housing Authority, Peninsula Behavioral Health, but that's not our focus, that's theirs. And then there's retiree organizations, but again, that's not our focus. Our focus is really about the workforce in Clallam County, and, you know, from businesses needing those workers and those workers really deserving a good quality of life, especially if they grow up here. You know, the saying is our biggest export is our kids, and we're doing what we can to try to change that. So Calvin Goings, the assistant city manager of Port Angeles, posted something. Calvin, do you want to share your comments, or would you like me to just read them?
Go ahead and read them if you want.
Okay, will do. So Port Angeles continues to expand its capacity to serve new growth. To that end, the Capital Facilities Plan is kicking off a West Side sewer project later this year to further build capacity to meet future demands. So that's something that you were talking about, Bruce, that's an area, that UGA area, that really is lacking sewer capacity. So that's great news.
Yeah, I think that is, that's fabulous. I do look, you know, as part of this process, there's going to be a lot of close coordination between the county and the cities. And that's one of the topic areas that I very much look forward to having discussion with them on. So that's exciting news, and kudos to Port Angeles.
So one quick thought, I've had somebody come to my office and really be concerned about this under the Capital Facilities Plan. And I think John Nutter is on, who is the, he sure is, who is the chair of the OMC board. And he could speak more readily to this, but there, you know, our hospital is located on a bluff, and of course, it costs a lot of money to move that hospital, but is there something in the current Capital Facilities Plan to allow a relocation or expansion or something for a hospital that would serve, you know, be located somewhere between Sequim and PA?
I'm unaware of anything in there at this time, but that very well could be a topic that comes up. You know, he's right. It is on an unstable bluff, and there could be issues at some point. In fact, as I understand it, there has been some structural subsiding that, you know, just from a geologic standpoint, maybe not the best location. It's great that it's in Port Angeles, you know, an urban center, but creating a broader facility, that would be part of capital facility planning that could be done in the comp plan. But it's also, you know, the hospital is its own entity and can also make its own choices on that. Still, I think it would behoove us to have a look at that.
We'll take it, Bruce.
Yeah.
All right. Like I said, there's a whole lot of topics we need to learn, and I can give you what I'm providing now is just an overview of what we know at this point.
Great. Awesome. Thanks.
Sure. So moving on, just to be clear, those Clallam County again is required to let me back up. Growth Management Act was adopted in Washington State in 1990. Clallam County did its first round of planning under the act by adopting an update to its comprehensive plan in 1995. Since then, there's been a requirement for updating the comprehensive plan roughly once every 10 years or so. And we are required, both Clallam County and the three incorporated cities, to have an update completed for our comprehensive plan by June 30th of 2025. The map that's before you shows in green the counties that are required to plan under the act, and Clallam County always has. There's also several counties that decided to opt in to plan under the act, and including Pacific on the west side, and then Kittitas, Douglas, and so forth. And then there's a series of 11 counties that are not required to plan under the act because they have not experienced the rate of growth that triggers it. But they still have to do critical area natural resource planning as required by the act. So there's mandatory elements that all counties have to comply with. So generally, and why do we have to do the update? Well, conditions change. Part of what we have to do in our update is evaluate how the comprehensive plan has affected growth over the preceding 10 years, and then see if the policies need to change in order to meet act objectives. Secondarily, the act is constantly being edited by the state legislature. So new requirements then have to be brought in and the plan amended in order to incorporate those new requirements. This year, we're probably likely to see an integration of climate science in, for example, our critical area protection. Those are our stream corridors and wetlands that are outside of shorelines, and landslide hazard and so forth. Evaluating best available science is a requirement of the act, so that requires constant updating. Obviously, I've already mentioned there's an abundance of new housing regulation that has to be integrated into our comprehensive plan. And land use, as I've already mentioned, our industrial land base, on paper, it looks great. We have about 729 acres of industrial zoned land. But when you examine it closely, a lot of that is like DNR owned. There's 270 acres affiliated with the state prison out at Clallam Bay, and the likelihood that any of that would ever be used for industrial purpose really is nonsensical. So when you look at
it doesn't have urban services out there.
There
So
are no
how are you
urban
supposed to create?
services.
Yeah.
Well, it's not only that. What interest does the DNR have in creating industrial zone uses on its property? So what it comes down to is we have roughly about 25 lots covering about 78.7 acres that is currently zoned, that is currently available for development zoned industrial. And so that's about 3.1 acres per lot. And out of those, the vast majority are currently not served by urban services. So the state of our industrial land base is pretty poor right now. And so moving ahead with infrastructure expansion, and I think Colleen can speak to this most broadly, finding additional lands of consolidated ownership so that we can attract environmentally friendly plant size businesses that can create family wage jobs and let that land work for us.
And potentially energy generation as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Renewable energy generation. Yeah.
And that would certainly dovetail into what we were talking about, the impacts of climate. I mean, if flows in the Columbia River were to drop substantially, Bonneville Power Administration would certainly feel it. And of course, us being at the end of that, we would most definitely feel it. So resiliency.
And then, yeah, resiliency for the West End. The Clallam
Sure.
PUD has been talking about that at length. And how could they have their own renewable energy generation on the west end of the county because they experience so many power outages?
Yeah, yeah, precisely. Infrastructure planning will be part of the update, you know, again, looking at those, you know, the utility issues that we have, coordination, as I mentioned, with the cities on zoning choices, hopefully moving ahead, not only with economic development, but a broader array of housing options, and capital facilities planning is all going to be part of the new update. There's undoubtedly going to be more, but it'll get quite interesting because, you know, we can have a great idea, but once it gets time to start putting that into practice on the real world, I think that's when you start to see folks come out with strong opinions one way or the other on these matters, and we'll see how that all washes out. We are, not to shift the gears too much. Okay, yeah, we already talked about this stuff, integration of climate science, housing, land use, likely options for housing within designated urban growth areas. Again, that's kind of where we're going to be solving this problem, and infrastructure, coordination with cities and capital facilities planning. I did want to mention before I get into the current building stats, Clallam County, we're working through updating our permit software. For over 20 years, we've been using Tidemark's permit plan. It's no longer supported, so we've been crashing. Originally, we were supposed to make the change over to Tyler's Intergov system in February. That's been pushed back till May. But the positive is when it does finally happen, it'll have the capability of doing remote submittal of permit, submittal of plans, and payment for permits. So folks on the west end don't have to take a day to drive out to Port Angeles just to do that. So I'm looking forward to those changes. Just to give you a sense of where we are in terms of building stats, total units built in 2022, we had 185. I took a look back at 2019, there was 222, that's pre-COVID. So it represents about a 17% reduction from pre-COVID numbers. Now, given all the challenges we already talked about, that's actually pretty good. I'm not feeling as bad about the pace, even though the pace still needs to be picked up to address housing stock. And I'm also pleased to report that currently we have about a 2-week turnaround on building permits. That is unless there's a septic issue. Typically, water availability and septic permits are taking it about a month to get your building permit. Certainly, if there's a planning issue like with SEPA or a critical area permit, that can certainly add delay. But generally speaking, our building department is doing a great job getting things out, and they're constantly looking at ways to be more efficient. So I look forward to working with them on that.
Just to clarify, Bruce, those numbers represents the units in the unincorporated areas of the county. Okay.
Correct. I don't have stats on the cities, and if I did, I wouldn't post them anyway.
I pulled a bunch of those. I think Ted Hennessy worked with the EDC a couple of years ago, and we pulled them for the cities, but that may be 2 years old now.
Yeah.
But we'll share those with you.
Okay. And with the brief time that we have left, unless there's any pressing questions on that, well, then I'll move ahead. There's a lot of legislation that we've been watching this year. Some of the bills that I think are favorable is Senate Bill 5517. This would reverse a Supreme Court decision in Foster versus Ecology down in the city of Young. And basically, it will state that hydraulic continuity with surface water is not in and of itself a reason to deny a water withdrawal permit. Why is that important? Because we are dependent on water withdrawal for certain areas of Clallam County, city of Sequim, certainly in Carlsberg. And having the ability to work through these things and mitigate issues is critical for us to move forward. If there's an absolute stone wall because, you know, an aquifer, for example, surfaces 3 miles north of a withdrawal location, and they're saying that, hey, that's important for in-stream flow, then this basically will say, that might be true, but that alone isn't enough to say no. You have to show the work, and it gives us a better playing field in order to solve these problems. The Senate Bill 5258 and its parent or its sidekick House Bill 1298 will allow special regulations for the placement of condos and townhouses from 2 to 12 units, and most critically, is the state is instructing the Building Code Council to make changes in order to streamline this. And I think this is a brilliant opening for 2 reasons. Number one, they're recognizing that it's an impediment, as I mentioned earlier. Secondly, they're requiring that they make changes. So I see this as an opening of the broader discussion. And as long as housing remains an issue, I think there is a need to discuss regulations that, although achieving a function, still has to be promulgated in the context of what makes the most sense and avoid unintended consequences. House Bill 1133 allows detached accessory dwelling units with defined limits. This is good for a couple of reasons. We do have detached ADU standards in Clallam County, but there is a difference between various counties. Counties who, prior to the adoption of the Growth Management Act, if they didn't have ADU standards, were only allowed to adopt them if they considered density. So I think the court case was up in San Juan County, where they said because they didn't have it before the adoption of the act, if you had like a 5-acre zoning, you would need a minimum of 10 acres in order to have a detached ADU. Well, the state is now saying, no, all rural areas should be allowed to do this, and urban areas. House Bill 1149 with Senate Bill 5202 has the potential of raising $4 billion available to address housing insecurity and a workforce revolving load program. The beauty of this is it may open up avenues for assisting in funding for infrastructure, which would be fabulous. And similar to Senate Bill 5258, we have House Bill 1167 that will provide grants for pre-approved middle housing plans. And again, the building code is instructed to make changes to the IRC standards, the International Residential Code, for multiplexes. So a softening of those stringent requirements in order to reduce costs and make housing more available. And I'm sorry for going over. I hope that's sufficient for you guys. Are there any questions?
We had a few in the chat. let's see, Angela had a question about, it seems that the changes you're discussing will require another update to comp plans. Oh, no, that was Mike McAleer's. To the comp plans by the cities and counties. However, the countywide planning policies have not really been updated since the original comp plan was adopted. Are you looking to get the cities and counties together to update the countywide planning policies? And I know Mike
Absolutely.
used to be, yeah, on the planning commission, or no, the permit advisory board. That's what it was. So Bruce, I
Yes.
cut you off.
No, that's fine. I completely favor a rewrite of the countywide planning policies. I think it's high time that they be updated. We know more now, and we can, and I think we're going to be reliant on that document moving forward to create the kind of work environment that the cities and the county can work under. I personally am highly optimistic with the people I get to work with in the various cities, and look forward to getting that ball rolling. I think that's a precursor to the actual comp plan update, because it forms the framework of how we agree on things. It sets the stage for urban service extension agreements and things of that nature, and make sure that what Clallam County is doing in the urban growth areas is consistent with what the various cities are doing, so that there's continuity.
And Angela says, what are you doing with current vacant buildings and using them for residential instead of new buildings? Understandably, commercial and residential zoning would be a factor.
Well, there's a push for that, less so in unincorporated Clallam County, but we do get several permits for renovating buildings in various stages of disrepair. There's an economic incentive, and I think we're going to be seeing more of that. We're not impeding it. We encourage it where it can be done. And so I think in cities in particular, that's gonna be more the norm heading forward.
Okay, great. All right, well, I see you had one more slide.
I do. You want me to hit it?
Oh, sure, why not?
Okay, well, this is my rants. House Bill 1099 requires at least prevailing wage for public works contracts. And I think you've all heard Colleen rant about this herself. Prevailing wage means basically I-5 corridor standard wages. And what it means is when we have public projects in Clallam County, local firms cannot compete. And so we still have a push to want to change that, but there seems to be a strong constituency in the I-5 corridor to maintain it under the auspice of that's how you achieve fairness in public expenditure. But it does harm us, and so I do not support that. House Bill 1181 requires a 15th element to the comprehensive plan for climate change and resiliency. And the reason I don't particularly like this is I think that the impetus is already there for us to integrate climate policy throughout the comprehensive plan, but doing it in a way that makes sense to local conditions. What this bill would do is basically make it a rough shot component required. In other words, you don't just create a new element, you have to update all elements. And it's a heavy lift, it's costly, and I question whether it's even necessary. And some of the standards that seem to be coming out of this, creating statewide standards for local levels of greenhouse gas emissions and per capita vehicle miles traveled. I could see some of that stuff working. It'd be kind of nice, one of the things, if you live in one of the suburbs of Seattle, you have a long commute just to get to your office space. What if the GMA allowed more localized commercial centers? That might reduce that per capita vehicle miles traveled. But forcing this statewide, in my opinion, does not make sense. We can achieve the sensible changes that climate change requires of us without this additional regulatory requirement.
Got it. All right. Well, hey, we're at 9:07. I think it's a world record for going over. Sorry about that. But Bruce, this was such great information, and we really appreciate your time today and your experience and expertise and educating us on this complex process that will be very interesting going forward, but is incredibly important. So with that, everybody, I'm going to sign off. So have a great morning and enjoy your day. Thank you.